The Atari Jaguar is perhaps one of the most important video game consoles of the 1990s, as it not only marked the end of an iconic brand, but it also was witness to a series of oddball games that make the Atari Jaguar library so unique. With some of these titles seen as good and others seen as bad, and some I have to say are way better than the media portrays. Morph. I don't know where that came from. Games like iWar, Trevor McFur, Iron Soldier, Escape from the Mutant Penguins, and Atari Carts, just to name a few, would be some of the most sought-after titles for the Atari Jaguar, and one of the many must-have titles for any Jaguar owners at the time. Atari would continue the cartridge format until September 21st of 1995, where we would see the release of the Atari Jaguar CD, which would only see 11 commercial releases in its short lifetime. After the discontinuation of the Jaguar CD, Telegames would release World Tour Racing and Iron Soldier 2 in 1997, being the last two official releases on the Jaguar CD add-on. Much like the Atari Jaguar, the Jaguar CD, despite its small library, had a series of games that made owning the Jaguar CD a must-have. Games like Blue Lightning, the direct sequel to Blue Lightning for the Atari Lynx, Battle Morph, the direct sequel to Cybermorph, Primal Rage, and more. Even including the updated versions of Iron Soldier 2 with music and an updated version of Hover Strike with higher frame rate and additional content. The Jaguar CD should have been the saving grace of the Atari Jaguar, but unfortunately it was released too late to an already dying market. Having had dozens of CD-based games planned for it, the Jaguar CD would be left in the dust with 70% of its planned library being ultimately cancelled. More on this later. As mentioned before, the Atari Jaguar and Jaguar CD were no stranger to strange titles, let alone to games that should have seen way more attention than they got at the time. Enter Highlander, the Last of the McLeods. Highlander, the Last of the McLeods was based on the animated TV series of Highlander, which was a spin-off of the popular movie franchise from 1986. It goes without saying that you cannot simply discuss Highlander for the Jaguar CD without discussing where its origins stem from. Highlander sparked a generation of fans unlike any fandom of its time, with people today recanting stories of their high school and college youth where they, and many others like them, would parade around in a long trench coat and often making absurd purchases of swords and katana. In contrast, whereas anime cosplay is the core of today's social trends, Highlander was the core of any fantasy nerd's identity along the likes of various popular franchises of the time. And if you're telling me you didn't get an exuberant feeling of power and excitement the moment you put your hair in a man bun and threw in that trench coat, then you, sir, or lady, are fraud. Because in 1986, there was nothing cinematically cooler than Connor McLeod of the Clan McLeod. I've always wanted to do this. There can only be one! Highlander as a franchise would follow the story of Scotsman Connor McLeod on his immortal journey through time and tragedy as other immortals would battle it out for the ages. As the old quote goes, there can only be one, and as such, each immortal would grow stronger with the quickening, the absorption of life energy from an immortal that they had defeated. In the end, only one immortal could live forever. A battle that would transcend space and time as the series progressed, as well as an attempt to show different perspectives and outlooks on this war that mortals would never fathom, except for the Watchers, of course.
So you do know me?
We know all about you.
For context and lore, the Watchers were mortals who had become aware of the endless battle and strived to document the events that lied within. Highlander would also spark a series of novels, comic book, even an anime known as Highlander: The Search for Vengeance. And yes, the spin-offs such as the TV series and the spin-off of the spin-off known as Highlander the Raven would try to adapt new characters as the main focus. But somewhere in the mix of everything that was sacred and holy rests the tale of Highlander, the animated series. A cartoon that managed 2 full seasons before its cancellation and was explicitly targeted towards children. I need to go on the record and say that Highlander was never intended for kids, and why it was adapted for kids is beyond me. But Highlander the animated series would fall into that weird category where companies would try tirelessly to convert franchises into kids shows, falling into the same theme or category as the likes of Power Stone, Virtua Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Darkstalkers, Zelda, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, RoboCop, The Mask, and more. Sometimes these cartoon adaptations would get it right, but most of the time it was seen as an unruly abomination. Highlander the animated series falls somewhere in between, where it has its flaws but also has its charm, neither good nor bad. Highlander the animated series begins with our protagonist Quentin Dundee, who was later revealed to be the last of the McLeods after a swift defeat. Perhaps one of the most contradictory points of the original lore is Connor McLeod from the 1986 film would make a brief appearance before being banished to another dimension, but also retconning the fact that immortals can't have children. It's clear that the writers of Highlander the animated series had intended to separate the cartoon from the original franchise as much as possible. They acknowledged the original Highlander by killing the main character Connor McLeod off for the sake of a new narrative, and implying that an immortal may not be able to have children, but he can oddly speak into existence or prophesize a successor. That makes absolutely no sense, and that bugs me.
And on that day, Cortan, you will know your end has come.
No!
Throughout the series, Quentin would do battle with the likes of Cortan and his many minions, while liberating villages and cities along the way. Cortan represents an arch villain who has claimed supreme rulership over the world after the Immortals' truce, the truce he so desperately denounces. Although this was deemed a children's show, the series would not spare children from the fate of minor and supporting characters who would effectively die for the sake of plot. The series would continue for a total of 40 episodes and would not receive a proper conclusion. Although Season 1 received relatively positive reviews after only a standard of 13 episodes, Season 2 would find itself trailing on rather than providing fans with proper context and in some cases leaving plot holes so vast that they simply chose to ignore them instead of justifying them in future episodes. Despite all the negatives that is Highlander the animated series, as I've said, there is a certain level of charm that garners it in an attempt at watching. For one, animation and art style is unique. Acting is about as what you expect from a 90s cartoon, and some characters do grow on you after some time. Perhaps not an easy series to recommend, but for any true Highlander fan, it's worth a watch if you're after a quick giggle. Although a firm biased opinion on my part, the best advice that I can give you is while watching the series, it's better to treat it as a parody instead of a children's spinoff. I feel like having this thought process in mind makes the series more bearable. Unlike the film franchise the cartoon was based on, Highlander the animated series would not get a comic book spin-off or follow-up novels. Instead, it would get a single game published under the same name as Episode 1, known as Highlander the Last of the McLeods, released exclusively on Atari Jaguar and a port to MS-DOS with no real differences in design or gameplay, other than the key inputs. With the Atari Jaguar version being the one people tend to remember the most, and also for mostly no known good reasons. I want to go on the record and state that my review of this game is not going to be a heavily negative one, and we'll get into that in just a moment. You start Highlander Last of the McLeods with a condensed series of cutscenes which are animations pulled directly from Episode 1 and repurposed to tell a different take on the beginning of the animated franchise. For one, in the cartoon, Quentin McLeod has an adopted sister by the name of Clyde of the Dundee, who is also accompanied by her alien pet named Gaul. Clyde represents a recurring maiden in distress for Quentin throughout the series and is perhaps one of the most significant characters in the narrative. But for Highlander Last of the McLeods, she and her companion Gaul are completely voided as the story states, in my worst Scottish accent ever. His village and his life have been destroyed, with his mother murdered and his sister and clan captured by the hunters of Magonda. Quentin McLeod is alone. He must find a way to rescue the Dundees and fulfill his destiny. It wasn't so bad.
His village and his life have been destroyed. With his mother murdered and his sister and clan captured by the hunters of Magonda, Quentin MacLeod is alone. He must find a way to rescue the Dundees and fulfill his destiny.
Once you begin the game, you're introduced to a weird assortment of modern technology and primitive huts in the Dundee village, taking place in the 27th century. Highlander, The Last of the McLeods, is the classic depiction of a recovering world from an apocalyptic event. This theme has been depicted in various forms of media over the generations, such as H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Josh Kirby, Time Warrior, Mutant Chronicles, and Cloud Atlas, just to name a few. You are awoken to the destruction of everything around you, and a few foot soldiers still linger about. It will take you no time at all to learn that this game is a very unforgiving one. Much like Alone in the Dark or Dr. Hauser for the 3DO, or Resident Evil and Tomb Raider for PlayStation 1, you are forced to utilize uncomfortable yet iconic tank controls. Matching this with the Atari Jaguar controller is no comfortable or easy task, but once you get the hang of it, you are readily on your way to your first death. Battle mechanics in Highlander The Last of the McLeods is absolutely awful in every way of the word. Hit detection and timing are off no matter what you do, and you will find yourself dying time and time again, as timing your hits can be difficult. In some cases, it takes an unreasonably large amount of hits to even take out one guard. God forbid you find yourself surrounded by two of them. I highly recommend that you take your time exploring and luring the enemies away one by one in order to give yourself a fair advantage. Also, save your game as much as possible, as you will most certainly need it. Remember to have a memory track, otherwise you will be unable to save your game. Highlander pegs itself as one of the most difficult games to complete, but luckily there are invincibility cheat codes for the game that prevent you from receiving damage. And if anyone is interested, I will be doing a full playthrough of the Atari Jaguar version with this cheat code active, as I am no glutton for suffering. Subscribe and hit that bell notification for anyone interested in seeing that soon. Now, as mentioned before, all negatives aside, Highlander the animated series and its game does have some charm to be appreciated. For example, some of the 3D animations in the game, like the death animation, are very well executed, and once you get away from the village you can find plenty to explore. Although the animation style is primitive compared to most 3D or polygonal games of the time, its style holds up in the same vein as those before it. And it's also important to note that the Jaguar and the Jaguar CD faced a lot of problems during development, as developers were forced to make impressive titles on incredibly limited hardware. Yet, despite the limitations, the Jaguar and the Jaguar CD managed to get some incredible 3D polygonal titles such as iWar, Cybermorph, Battlemorph, Checkered Flag, 05, Missile Command 3D, Iron Soldier, and its sequel, Iron Soldier 2. Highlander is not excluded from this exception, as the game offers one of the most impressive game engines and visual presentations on the Jaguar, in my personal biased opinion. Now, I do not expect many to agree with me on that, but much like any other 3D title for the Jaguar, Highlander is an experience unlike any other. It really comes down to how you choose to appreciate or disregard it. So, the question is Highlander the last of the McLeods for the Atari Jaguar CD a good game? I would argue no, it is not. But I do like it. Absolutely I like it, and I know that is very contradictory. So let me explain. I found that the game offers more pros than it does cons, despite the negative hype that it has acquired over the decades. On my channel, I always try to find the positives in something, but like always, I can't ignore when something is bad. Like a delicate balance of yin and yang, I have to accept the pros and cons of anything that I review. It's weird to me that I find myself admitting that a game I consider bad to be something that I have genuinely enjoyed. I had fun researching and playing Highlander. Granted, my experiences may be different as a YouTuber and not an average gamer, but I found myself forced to examine everything I can for the sake of factual documentation. As much as one might gripe about how bad this game is, and I myself almost being one of them, I instead found myself marveling at the very concept. And I know what you're asking, but Kazdan, you're not making any sense. Yeah, I know, and it boggles my mind too. So what makes this game bad for me? Well, first impressions are very poorly executed. From the HUD, or the lack thereof, the menus, and the cheap deaths, it's enough to make the average gamer say that this game is bad. Mix that with the fact that the game doesn't exactly start you off with a tutorial or proper direction of where to start, and most people who play this game will miss the most obvious help systems that the game provides, and instead find more deaths and frustration than they will enjoyment. In this game, you are defenseless without a sword, and raw dogging the game without proper protection is exactly like your first marriage. I said what I said. However, if you take the time to be patient in combat, it will not take you long to figure out when to strike an opponent and defeat them swiftly. One other fact often overlooked is that this game was stuck in development hell for a year before Atari forced Lore Designs to shovel this game out for the release of the Jaguar CD add-on. This game needed another solid year for polish, and that was something Atari didn't have. A Google search for documentation will reveal a memo sent by Eric Smith to John Carell of Atari, where he would express his concerns regarding the quote-unquote competence of Stephen Mitchell, stating that he was a competent but not outstanding programmer. It would go on to conclude as follows. My conclusion, therefore, is that Lore is capable of completing the texture mapping and shading work. However, I believe that it will take them longer than they estimate, and they will require a certain amount of hand-holding from us. As tensions rose to meet a deadline for release, Highlander was seemingly pushed to market with a series of issues that made some in-game mechanics lackluster, and that being said, Atari and Lore Design came together to create a functional game that took advantage of Cinepack, full motion capture 3D animation, and an open-world 3D engine that had never been achieved before on the Atari Jaguar. Love it or hate it, Highlander was a success. Highlander offers something that I was not expecting on the Atari Jaguar. The world feels open and vast for a game of this scale. You will find ample supply of challenges and puzzles to solve. It's as open as an open-world game could be on the Jaguar CD. Never forget what they took from us. I definitely feel that with a little bit of fine-tuning and optimization, this game could have been enjoyable. Unfortunately, it has failed, even today, to meet a following that can properly enjoy its quirkiness, so to speak. One day I would love to see an updated version of Highlander by the homebrew community. This has already been done before by Towers 2 and has been released by Songbirds Productions. It acts as a definitive way to enjoy the Atari Falcon Classic on your Atari Jaguar. As for an update on Highlander for the Jag, that is perhaps the most unlikely due to licensing and legal issues. Highlander The Last of McLeod represents one of the many lost gems for the Jaguar CD, as the game never truly feels concluded. This is mostly in part due to its cancelled sequels, which would have played a major role in what the franchise would have reached as a climax. The life of the Atari Jaguar CD was very short-lived, with games like American Hero, Black Ice White Noise, Mortal Kombat 3, Dactyl Joust, Nerf Max Force, Deathmatch, Varuna's Force, Demolition Man, and more being cancelled, alongside the two games Highlander The Quest of Knowledge and Highlander The Time of Endings. In a completely separate video, possibly planned in the near future, I'd like to go over in depth about Highlander 2 and 3 for the Jaguar, as they serve an important part in the cancellation of the Jaguar and the Jaguar CD. In short, Highlander 2 The Quest of Knowledge would follow the story of your friend and mentor Ramirez, who, through their journey, will come in contact with a new beast called the Devil Beast, who would poison Ramirez and prompt you to escort him to a nearby village, where you would then need to find a janitor named Genobin, who would cure Ramirez of the Devil Beast's poison. Highlander 3, The Time of Endings, would act as a proper conclusion to the trilogy. It would feature a wide selection of new characters and a vast showcase of many characters of the animated series, plus introducing some new concepts while revisiting the maps and locations featured in Highlander 2. Basically, a reskin or repurposing of the previous engine. Highlander 2 and 3, for the sake of narrative, would have loosely piggybacked off of Season 2 of Highlander, the animated series, and would introduce unique and original Cinepack animations that better suited the game's development. It appears that the two sequels would have used more 3D animation and less FMV from the TV series, as well as introduced more monsters and new characters to the animated universe. Highlander The Last of McLeod serves as the only surviving game in a seemingly plagued ocean of lost, terrible games based on the Highlander franchise, not counting the ZX Spectrum release of Highlander, which is a blocky, unplayable mess with next to zero substance. Thanks, Ocean. As mentioned before, in Highlander The Last of McLeod, you awaken in your village and find everything destroyed. Your first instinct is to fight any enemies you encounter, but this is quickly proven to be a bad idea, as battle mechanics are horrendous. One thing I have found commonly in many of the Highlander playthroughs found online is that people try to fight the game with their bare hands and completely fail to utilize the stick on the far gate. In order to access the gate, you need to first explore the huts and find your mother's amulet. Examine the amulet and an FMV taken from Season 1 will play, prompting your mother to instruct you to find Ramirez. You cannot break the chains on the door with the stick until you do this, even if you find the stick first. Use the stick on the gate, and this will allow you to access a back waypoint of the game to meet with Ramirez, who will give you your ancestral sword. This will make fighting the enemies much easier. There is also an option to unlock a rubber chicken as a joke, and surprisingly this weapon is the strongest weapon in the game. This can be found in a secret room called the Rogue's Gallery, which featured the developer's information and such. A nice novelty that immortalizes those involved with making this game in a more obvious way. Click the link above or below if you'd like to see this room. In the village, you can find a myriad of items in the hut, such as bread, drinks, and cheese. On a side note, Quentin must be a glutton for diarrhea, because my intolerant self could never. You'll also find your mother's amulet and the aforementioned stick, allowing you safe passage to the Hill of Oves, where you'll encounter Ramirez and the legendary Sword of the McLeods, as it was destined for your hands alone. Eventually, before you venture from the village, find the watchtower and unalive the guard in order to acquire the map of the Highlands. Not that it really does too much anyways, the game is fairly open and self-explanatory. The canyons mark themselves as the biggest part of the game. Before you reach that point, however, you'll find a series of other items, like Clyde's water wheel, which when examined will also play more FMV. You'll also find more food and a wooden plank. This will come in handy later. After that, it's off to the canyon where you'll meet your first pitfall. You could easily use the plank here to get across, but I've also managed to jump across the platform before, as the distance isn't too much. Do not bother trying to save the plank for later, as using it on other pitfalls yields useless and weird results, as you can see here. You'd be better to drop the plank later as a marker if you get lost somewhere, as I often do when playing this game. Dropping a scroll or a now useless item could mean the difference to completing the game quicker or not. As mentioned before, the canyon feels more open than the village area, but its environments, although beautifully rendered for the time that this came out, can be a bit repetitious and hard to remember. In the canyon, you'll need to locate the lever which is in the hut, and in the quicksand nearby, where you can locate the gas gun. This gun is incredibly limited and will take multiple hits to kill an enemy. Save it for when you are in a tight spot, and when I mean in a tight spot, I mean a tight spot. If the enemy gangs up on you, it is an instant game over. In one of the canyon huts, you'll come across a rusted ladder, and you can locate a crowbar right in front of it. You'll need to use this crowbar twice, once to unlock a chest in your village, and a second time to open a gate in the sewer levels. Inside the village chest, you will acquire a hunter's uniform. You'll need to use this in the sewer level as well. The hunter uniform will allow you safe passage into the hunter's chamber, much like in the TV series, and without it you cannot progress in the game. Remember to go back for this uniform. I cannot stress that enough. As you traverse the sewer level, it's important to note that the majority of the floors follow an oddly specific H or T pattern. As long as you remember this, it becomes easier to map out the sewer levels and find your way around. You'll find a variety of keys that unlock doors and gates, and the game, despite its enemy difficulty, by this point, becomes incredibly easy to navigate, but never loses its feel of quote-unquote openness, allowing the player to choose where they want to go. You'll find more ammo for your gas guns as well, and be witness to really cool Cinepack cutscenes that adds more depth to the game. Some of the Cinepacks tie into FMVs taken from the final episodes of Season 1, and really helps to recreate the narrative. A good example of this is when you have to use the stopwatch to make it through the sewer turbines. Once you get to the final gate, you'll need to use the security key to unlock the door, upon which a cutscene will play, and we finally get a glimpse of what your sister Clyde would have looked like in the game. I realize at this point that it probably sounds like I'm ragging on the game, but I have to be honest when I say that Highlander for the Atari Jaguar really does feel like a revolutionary concept for its time, and it stands out on the Jaguar CD as one of the most ambitious titles in its limited library. The ending serves itself as a very anticlimactic ending, but in hindsight, you also just completed the most difficult game on the Jaguar CD, and therefore, you should honestly pat yourself on the back, because this game is no easy feat. Congratulations, you officially rock. In closing, I had a lot of fun with Highlander: The Last of the McLeods, despite its many cons. I never felt satisfied with its conclusion, and it would have been really interesting to see the trilogy unfold. Highlander has always had a bit of an identity crisis with its constant remakes and video game adaptations that never get released. As someone who grew up with the franchise, I can attest that the sudden plot twists and remakes creates a bit of a jarring effect on plot, and can at times be difficult to follow in a linear path. It appears that Atari's attempt to rectify this in a video game trilogy was no exception, having been unable to yield more than one full game in the Jaguar's lifetime. But, like the story goes, there can only be one. Such an ironic fate for a Highlander on the Jaguar CD. If you like this video, maybe check out some of my other videos, like my Beetleborg video game video, or my Lost Media video on Thea Realm Fighters for the Atari Jaguar. Remember to hit the subscribe button and click that bell, as this channel wouldn't exist without your support. I've been Kazdan Azam with Kraz Productions, and thank you for watching.
Because, you get it? Because it's make pretend, and it's a pretend sword, and it's daddy. It's kind of fun. You have no idea what I'm talking about, dude.
Are you talking to me? It's recording. You told me to record, so I thought you were recording something, not talking to me.
Okay.